Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our first webinar of the school year. We usually do 10 webinars a year in correspondence with the school year, so it's great to be getting things going again. We're going to be talking today about feeding our feathered friends, so bird feeding, and how it can be such a really great educational tool. And this is a good time of year to start thinking about it because it's migration season coming on, winter soon on its heels. Is a great time to start thinking about feeding birds. So thank you so much for joining us tonight and spending your evening with us. A couple little of housekeeping things real quick. If you haven't used Zoom much before, I know we're probably feeling a little overfamiliar with conference technology these days, but when I went full screen, it probably went full screen for you. I'm actually going to recommend that you exit full screen. You can do that up by your options. Sometimes hitting escape works too. And that will allow you to dock the chat window to the side. We'll have some opportunities for discussion, and I want you to be able to share ideas and relevant links and things like that with each other too. And in light of that, make sure you open up the chat window, and right above where you would type to speak, there should be a drop down. You're going to want to make sure that that says send to everyone so that we can all see each other's. The other option is just Susan and I will see what you're sending. So we are coming to you from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where our mission is to interpret and conserve the Earth's biological diversity through research, education, and citizen science focused on birds. The Cornell Lab of Ornithology is part of the Cornell University system, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that Cornell is located on. So Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayacono, or the Cayuga Nation. The Gayacono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayacono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of the Gayacono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. And I wanted to take that time, and Cornell is making a strong effort, and the lab is making a stronger effort to make connections like this and honor the history of the land that we are located on. And that is one of the ways that we can get to know and form a stronger connection with our land, is by getting to know the history of it. And another way is by getting to know the plants and animals that we share this land with. And that ties into our mission, where I'm with the K-12 education team at the lab, and our mission is to create innovative resources and deliver transformative trainings that empower educators and families to build young people's science skills while inspiring them to connect to nature, explore biodiversity, and engage in citizen science projects. And as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about feeding birds today, which is a really great way to make some of those connections, both to science and our local animals, but also to our local habitats. And we achieve our mission through 2 main ways, by creating and distributing curriculum resources, anything from one-off activities about nature exploration, all the way up to full science curriculum kits. And we also do educator trainings, both online and in person. In this webinar, we're going to discuss some of the bird feeding basics. I'll share some resources with you that support learning inspired by birds, and particularly by feeder birds, and introduce you to some citizen science projects that will complement feeding birds. So I've talked a lot already about feeding birds, but I want to throw this question out to you. Why feed birds? This can be from your perspective as someone who enjoys nature or as an educator. Why feed birds? So we can watch them without leaves in the way. Absolutely. We had one of those bird walks today where half the time I was playing, is it a leaf or is it a bird? To help birds, since habitat loss is occurring, to attract them closer for observation, absolutely. Learn more about native species, give them extra support for surviving harsh weather. Selfishly attract them so we might observe them. Yeah, sometimes it feels like we get the most benefit, but thankfully it is a mutually beneficial arrangement. Absolutely, yeah. So you guys are picking up so many of these really great points. There's a lot of joy that we can derive for them as people just from getting to observe birds closely. There's a lot that it benefits birds too. So this is actually a picture from the UK, but it illustrates really well one of the benefits to birds of bird feeding. So this looks like a pretty harsh, deep snow where it might be difficult for birds to access food. So feeding birds can really act as a supplemental food source. So something that provides them with a little extra calories that help them in tougher times. Some folks have worried about whether feeders might actually change behaviors of birds, and that's not something we have to worry about too much. Most studies show that birds really treat it as a supplemental food source. And as you all pointed out, feeding birds brings them right to you, which is great for us because as educators, it means we don't necessarily have to have binoculars to be able to view birds and teach our students about birds. And when they're up close and they're eating, there's actually a lot of really cool behaviors that you can witness. So there are things that happen at feeders like dominance hierarchy, which you might notice in the form of a cardinal chasing away a chickadee or something like that. So there are really cool behavioral observations that we might get to see at a bustling place like a feeder. And it provides us with a really great opportunity to incorporate citizen science, which we'll talk more about later. And together, feeding birds and participating in citizen science provides us with these really exciting and real-world opportunities to study wild animals. It's a relatively low-cost activity. It's year-round. It helps birds. And as someone said in the comments, it provides an opportunity to help kids be kind to other creatures, form connections with other creatures, sparks their curiosity, and helps them develop these connections to their local environment. So oftentimes when I say all these things about birds, I'll get a teacher who's like, great, this sounds wonderful, but I just don't have birds where I am. And to that, I would say, don't worry, you do. You're just suffering from a condition that we all suffer from at one point and another in our lifetime, and that is bird blindness. But the good news is that once you go out there and you start looking for birds in and around your communities, you will notice that they are absolutely everywhere. Some of you might recognize this as a scene from Hitchcock's The Birds, but I promise they won't hunt you down. All right, so let's dive into some of the resources, or excuse me, some of the ways that we can feed birds. So there are lots of different bird feeders out there, lots of different types. In the upper left-hand corner of this image, you will see a tube feeder. This is a classic feeder for smaller birds. Below that, we have a hummingbird feeder, which is a really specialized feeder, and it feeds sugar water. The blue jay in the middle is sitting on what I would probably term something like a platform feeder, which is like a flat space raised off the ground. This is great for larger birds. In the right-hand corner, we see a hopper feeder, which is kind of a mix between a platform feeder and a traditional feeder. And then you have the little downy woodpecker on a suet feeder. And so when you start thinking about feeding birds, all these choices and options might seem a little bit overwhelming. There's all different kinds, they feed different kinds of food, and how do you go about choosing the right one for your setting? Well, there is a tool for that. On the Project Feeder Watch website, which is a citizen science project we'll talk more about later, there are some really useful tools for you to launch your bird feeding experience. This one that I've taken some screenshots for is the Common Feeder Bird Interactive, and it will help you see what kind of seed in your area will attract what kind of birds. So different birds have different seed preferences, as you can see from this chart on the screen. So for example, we see that the sunflower seeds, which is in the top row, feeds almost every group of birds we have on this chart, except for pigeons as doves, whereas something like the Niger or thistle seed, second from the bottom row, only feeds finches. So the type of seed you put out is going to affect the type of birds that you attract. So you might be only interested in finches, but oftentimes we want to attract the greatest variety of birds. And so something like the sunflower seed is going to help you achieve that. So this is that interactive. And when you open it up, you'll be able to select region and select the type of food and the type of feeder and see what kind of birds you could expect to see. So this could be really useful for when you're planning your unit around birds, so you know what kind of birds you might expect to see at your feeder, so you can help your students learn them. And it will also help you figure out what type of food you might want to feed. So the top screenshot we have here is looking at all regions, Milo seed, and all feeder types. And you can see the types of birds that will eat this seed. And then the bottom screenshot is looking again at all regions, all type of feeders, but that black oil sunflower seed. And as you can see, it's a pretty big difference in the number and type of birds that you will attract. So this can help you with your planning in a number of ways. Let's talk a little bit about the types of feeders you can get by making them yourselves or acquire them in other ways. So if you don't have a ton of funding for buying feeders, you can make feeders. On the right-hand side here, we have the classic pine cone feeder. This one is using peanut butter as a base, but if you have allergies in your classroom, you can also use Crisco. On the right-hand side is a very classic soda bottle feeder. You can see that it's got some wooden dowels for perches and a little hole in there for the birds to pull the seeds out of. We sometimes like to do an activity where we challenge students to design their own bird feeders using recyclables and what we affectionately call junk. So if you have a junk drawer, you can rate it. You can rate your recyclables and challenge students to design their own feeders. Some really fun stuff you can do with that. You can also make these classic seed cakes. We do have a blog on our website that talks about some types of feeders that you can make. I believe Susan can share the link to that in the chat window for you all. And then you all will also have access to this bird feeder. So if you download the lessons that we talk about today, it'll take you to a link in our store where you can purchase one of these Pennington window bird feeders. So Pennington is a sponsor of our program and was kind enough to provide us with these window bird feeders for educators. You just have to pay $6 shipping to get them shipped to an organization address. I specify an organization address because that does affect the shipping cost and makes it more manageable for us so that we can keep the shipping cost as low as possible. And what's great about these feeders is that they stick to windows, so they bring the birds right to you, very, very close. And I know that when some people see that, there is a concern about window strikes. So window strikes are a big concern for birds. Birds don't see in quite the same way that we do, and they have difficulty discerning glass. They often see reflections as more habitat, or they'll see through a series of windows and think they can fly through them and end up colliding with the glass and sometimes be injured or killed. But when you have a feeder on the window, it actually turns out that it's in a really safe location. So if we look at this graph we see here, this was research that was done to figure out what is the safest distance to place a feeder from a window. So on the x-axis, we can see the distance from the window. On the y-axis, we are seeing percent fatalities after a window strike. So you can see that 1 meter or less, there's almost no fatalities. And so this is partially because most fatalities for birds happen when they're startled or they're flying away from something. And so they built up a lot of momentum and they hit the window hard. But if the feeder is on the window, then they don't have enough momentum to hurt themselves. The most dangerous zone is 5 meters or about 15 to 30, which is actually, I think, where a lot of us tend to want to put our feeders. So it turns out that that window feeder is a pretty safe way to feed birds. And I did see that there was a question in the chat window about where to download the lessons that I mentioned. I'm going to go in depth into those lessons in a little bit. And so Susan will be sharing a link to those in the chat window if she hasn't already. All right, so another question we often get about feeding birds is, well, when should you feed birds? And I think this question comes from a really great place of wanting to take care of and make sure we aren't harming our local birds. I often see this question in the context of, if I feed birds around migration time, are they going to stop migrating because they have a food source? That's not really a concern. Because it turns out what triggers a bird's urge to migrate has a lot more to do with photoperiod or the length of the day and daylight than it does with food resource availability. So they'll still get that Zugenruhe or that urge to migrate, even if there are supplemental feeding stations around. But feeding birds year-round isn't everybody's cup of tea. There can be some mess under the feeders. It can build up some cost if you're feeding them year-round. So if you wanted to target like the best time to feed birds for birds, it's going to have to do a lot with your local climate. So in my case, in central New York, it's going to be wintertime. It's going to be a really great and valuable time to feed birds. And sometimes I do tend to do that. I feed more in late fall and winter into early spring than in the summer. So I have to share this picture with you all. So you can see this really wonderful, gorgeous feeding station set up, but there's no songbirds there. Can anybody spot the reason why that might be? Yeah, folks are spotting the birds of prey in the picture. Absolutely. So up in the upper right corner, we've got a kestrel, our smallest falcon. And then down in the lower left, we've got a Cooper's hawk. So we've got predator birds hanging out, which is gonna discourage the songbirds from humming. Some folks don't like having, yeah, it's a food pyramid food station we've got going on here. So some folks don't really want to see feeder birds getting predated, so they might not be super into this. Your kids might find it fascinating. Depending on the age group, they might find it horrifying. But if you have this happening and there's no songbirds coming, there is a way to kind of deal with this. So a predator bird like this is going to start to recognize this food station as a food station for itself. So if you just take the feeders down for a week or so, these predator birds will move on, find a new place to stake out, and then you can put them back up and get your songbirds back. And if you fed birds before, you know this furry nemesis. Gray squirrels, red squirrels, squirrels in general are known to be the bane of bird feeders' existence. They will eat you out of house and home. Thank goodness they're so cute. So if you have problems with squirrels, there are a few things that you can do to help mitigate that. You can try the baffle strategy. So if you are feeding birds on a pole system, there's these bell baffles here that will stop the squirrel from climbing up the pole. If you have feeders hanging from a tree or something, you can try this sort of baffle that hangs above the feeder so they can't come down over it. The challenge here being that squirrels are excellent at jumping. So you have to keep feeders about 10 feet from any jumping platform, which if you're hanging from a tree, is probably going to be a challenge. So squirrels might just be a fact of life. And it turns out that they're pretty clever too, so they can find their way around sometimes. But if you're looking for more help and more tips about squirrels, there is a bird note that talks a little bit more about how to handle them. Susan has just shared some relevant links in the chat window for how to deal with different types of non-target species as your bird feeder, let's say. All right, now let's talk about some resources we have that can complement feeding birds. We have a bunch of free educator guides linked on our webpage, which have some great activities. Some of them talk about bird identification. So if you want to feed birds and start teaching bird ID, there's a few great books there, like Crow Not Crow will start teaching some bird ID skills. And along with these guides are some great activities for you to dive into and kind of enhance the learning around feeding birds and these beautiful books. Another source for you would be our science and nature activities for cooped up kids. These are activities that were designed with families and educators in mind and originally designed to be responsive to the early pandemic, but these days they're a really great resource for you to find some hands-on activities and even some self-directed learning that you can share with your students. They're articulated across the grade band, so there's a K2, 3-5, and 6-8 lesson for every topic, and they incorporate independent work for the older grade bands in writing prompts and hands-on activities. And we have lots of little great like outdoor or indoor activities that you can do with your students related to these topics. They are presented as Google slideshows, so kids can go through them at their own pace, or you can download them and use them in your classroom as well. Activity 9 is all about feeding wild birds, so it covers a lot of great topics, talks about what birds eat, how bird beaks relate to what they eat, and has that engineer your own bird feeder challenge that I mentioned earlier in there. So lots of great activities to take a look at there. And then I wanted to mention the Feather Friends curriculum, which is the one we've been building up to, and is the one that I mentioned has the link to purchase the bird feeder from our store. So this is a curriculum that is designed to be kind of a monthly touch point with birds. It's a free download. There are 10 monthly lessons for the school year. There are indoor and outdoor components to each lesson. Each lesson highlights some local birds that you can meet. And we take this approach of slowly introducing birds because this can be a really effective way to learn bird ID, is to get to know a few at a time. Themes in the lessons include things like biodiversity, habitat, flight and migration, conservation, and even working up towards participating in citizen science. Along with the lessons in the classroom are some home connections, so some sheets you can print out for students to take home and try some activities on their own as well. And each lesson is standards aligned, so NGSS. And you can get a sense for what this first September lesson is. Actually, this might not be September, but diving into the components of habitat and learning some effects that humans have on the environment. And this is what our Meet the Local Birds section looks like. All right, and I mentioned that it leads towards participating in citizen science. So one of the activities highlights the Great Backyard Bird Count, which is a citizen science project that I'll go into depth in a moment. Let's pause for a second and define what citizen science is together, since I've mentioned it several times. So in the chat window, if you could, please share some keywords or projects or a definition that comes to mind when you hear the term citizen science. And while you're all typing, I do want to mention that there is some conversation in the citizen science community about the term community science and choosing which one will represent projects in the future. There's some debate because citizen might be an alienating word for some folks. But community science tends to be projects that are started by community. So they design the project and decide the research question at hand, which is a little bit different than citizen science as we're using the term. So we'll talk about that in a moment. So some ideas I'm seeing in the chat window are students recording data, logging observations into databases, non-scientists gathering and reporting information that helps help scientists, iNaturalist as a program for citizen science. Wow, there's just so many great answers in here. I like Rachel's hundreds of eyes are better than just the two the scientist has. Yes, it's like an amplification. Suzanne shared the link to Zooniverse. This is so exciting because every definition I'm seeing in the chat window is great. People are sharing projects that they know. And when I started at the lab 7 years ago and I asked this question, I don't think that the answers were this on point. So it's really exciting to see this kind of change in our general knowledge around citizen science. Awesome. So yes, citizen science are projects where regular folks like you and me who aren't professional scientists go out, collect data about our observations of the natural world, and share that data with scientists through databases. And every time I talk about citizen science, I have to share this photo. So if you haven't seen this image before, even if you have, what do you think we're looking at here? Looks a lot like the night sky, like light pollution from space. Absolutely. Let me reframe my question a little bit. In the context of citizen science and our conversation about citizen science, what do you think this map might represent? All right, so Elizabeth is guessing that it is some form of showing involvement in citizen science. Suzanne's saying citizen science participation. Cool. Yes. So, oh, Margaret's got it. eBird reports. Yes. So this image is showing observations submitted to the eBird database. And this is even a few years old, this image. So every point of light that you see on this map is a submission to the eBird database. There's not really an underlying continental map here. The fact that you can see the shape of our world means there's that many people out there who care about birds, who are making observations and then sharing those observations with eBird. There's a crazy amount of detail here. You can see like shipping lines or cruise lines or something out to Hawaii, which is pretty fantastic. So if we were to think about this by the numbers, there have been more than 1 billion observations to the eBird database. There's about 725,000-ish checklists that have been submitted. And there's submitted from every country in the world, with more than 10,600 species being recorded, which is roughly 98% of all the species in the world. So if you think about that enormous amount of data and what it would take scientists to replicate that, it's just not possible. A database like this is only possible through citizen science, because citizen science is people-powered science. So here's our definition again. We really do view these projects at the lab as a partnership between volunteers, regular folks like you, me, and our students, and professional scientists to answer real world questions. And I think that part, that real world questions, is particularly motivating for our students. Kind of answers that essential question of, why are we doing this? Because it matters, because your data and your observations matter. Now, if birds aren't your thing, and I don't know why they wouldn't be, but then again, I am very biased. There is a citizen science project out there for you. If you like plants or bugs or the night sky, whatever you're into, whatever your students are into, there is a citizen science project out there for you. So I encourage you, if birds aren't feeling right for what you are teaching with your students, check out citizen science projects anyway. See if there's one that you want to participate in. And Susan has shared in the chat window the link to scistarter.org, which is a really great website that will help you search for projects by topic or location or age group of students you're working with. Now let's talk a little bit about the Cornell Lab of Ornithology citizen science projects. They all follow a really similar design. Step 1, identifying and observing birds. Step 2, collecting that data about your observations. Step 3, entering that data online. And then step 4, retrieving and viewing that online data. And that's something that's special about the labs project, is that you have access to all those more than 1 billion observations in the eBird database. And so this is a way that you can make your observations of your feeder birds really matter, is participating in citizen science. So let's talk a little bit about some of those projects and how you might participate in them. The first one I want to touch on is the Great Backyard Bird Count. This is a really great citizen science project. It's a low level of commitment. It happens for 4 days in February every year. It usually takes place on, is it President's Day weekend? Usually takes place over a long weekend. And all you have to do to participate is do 1 bird count over that 4-day period, and you've participated in the Great Backyard Bird Count. And I think it's a 15-minute count. And what's great about the Backyard Bird Count is that you can do it in any location. It can be obviously your backyard, it can be a park, it can be a schoolyard, it can be literally anywhere you can participate in this. And you will submit your sightings either through eBird, or I think there's a portal on the Great Backyard Bird Count website that will take you to a place where you can submit. And then you've participated, and it's a really great snapshot for us of what birds are doing in the winter time. Another very popular citizen science project from the lab is Project Feeder Watch. So the interactive about seeds and feeders that I mentioned earlier comes from this project. This is a really fantastic project that's got a really loyal following. So the idea for Project Feeder Watch is that you watch birds on 2 consecutive days, usually about a week apart. And it does not have to be all day. It can be another short count that you submit for these birds. And the count, there's a little bit more of a stronger protocol, I would say, with Project Feeder Watch. So when you join Project Feeder Watch, there is a small fee. I believe it's $18 for non-members and then $15 for members of the lab. When you join, you will get this poster that you see here of birds. There's an eastern one and a western one on the same poster. And this Feeder Watch handbook and instructions. So this is really helpful because Feeder Watch has some protocols that you can follow to count the birds. They're trying to really standardize how folks count birds across the country. And so this can be a really useful conversation to have with students, why scientific protocols exist and what they are. And for Project Feeder Watch, for example, it would be when you're counting birds, you are counting the maximum number of birds that you see at once. For example, a bird like a chickadee pictured right here on this poster likes to come in and grab a seed and fly away, and then come back and grab a seed and fly away. And it can be difficult to tell if you have more than 1 chickadee sometimes. So no matter how many visits there are, if you only see 1 chickadee at a time, you would only be putting 1 in. But if you see 2 chickadees at a time, then you would put 2 in. Whereas the place it might feel a little confusing is something like the Cardinals pictured here in the middle of the poster, where there's sexual dimorphism, meaning the male and the female look different. So if you saw a female cardinal and it was the only cardinal you saw at a time, and then a male cardinal came, but the female was gone, so you were still only seeing one cardinal at a time, you're still only going to count that as one. That might seem confusing because you know that there are two, but it standardizes the count protocol so that you're counting every bird exactly the same way, even if they are sexually dimorphic. And the Feeder Watch handbook will explain all of that and make sure that you are comfortable with all of the protocols. And that really is honestly the toughest protocol. And I wanted to put this here because I really want to bring home the fact that citizen science data is important and it is used by the scientific community. So this data that you're seeing in these graphs here, or these data, I should say, were collected from Project Feeder Watch about the species pictured here, the evening grosbeak. And Project Feeder Watch data was really the first set of data that captured these trends of population decrease in the evening grosbeak. So you can see the top graph we have is the North Atlantic region. The red line is the percentage of feeders visited. The blue line is the average number of birds seen at one time. You can see that there's a downward trend. And across all of these regions, we're seeing a downward trend, even if they aren't quite as sharp as what we saw in the North Atlantic region. So that's kind of a big deal, and that is important. This data was published. So this is data that is really being used by scientists and conservationists. And the thing about citizen science data is when we saw it in that eBird database, it is such a big database that it is what is going to capture these trends, these big level population trends. You need a lot of data to see them. And so citizen science is the key tool here to make that happen. All right, let's talk a little bit more about eBird. eBird's motto is any bird, anytime, anywhere. Every bird counts. So this is a year-round project. I should mention that Feeder Watch takes place November through April, so it's a shorter term project. eBird happens to be a year-round project, and you can submit from anywhere in the world, any bird that you see, any length of time that you're watching birds. So about, oh gosh, is it 10 years ago already? As eBird was approaching its 100th millionth observation, everybody was debating who was going to get that observation into the database, and kind of everybody thought it would be some hotshot birder somewhere, but it was 12-year-old Lebron here. And that's kind of a picture to me of how everybody's observations are equally important. And his observation was of the American robin, an arguably common bird. So observations of common birds by anybody and everybody are really important in these databases to help us see these big picture trends. What is great about eBird is that you can then check out the database and see some of these trends for yourself. So for example, this graph here is looking at ruby-throated hummingbirds and northern cardinals in Missouri. So say you're in Missouri and you want to know a little bit more about some species in your area, you can go to the Explore feature on eBird and check out the bar charts, which will lead you to the line graphs and generate these really cool frequency graphs that are looking at the percentage of checklists, or the frequency that these birds are seen in Missouri throughout the year. So we have on the x-axis January starting over here, and then all the way through December here. And so right in the middle here, we've got our summer months. This is mid-May into mid-August here. So I want you to take a look at this graph. The cardinal is the green line, and the ruby-throated hummingbird is the orange line. And just share with me in the chat window something you notice about these graphs. It can be a comparison between the two species or something in particular about one species. Okay, so we are seeing a few things. We're seeing that the northern cardinal is here year round, and it has a greater frequency in general than the hummingbird, for sure. Couple folks are noticing that the hummingbird disappears entirely from Missouri in the winter months. And from that have inferred that the hummingbird is a migratory species, and that's absolutely correct. Okay, so we've got a question here, and a couple people have noticed this. Why is there a dip for both of these species in mid-June? Anyone want to hazard a guess? What are birds doing in mid-June in Missouri? Nesting, absolutely. Shauna, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Shauna is also noticing that maybe fewer people are observing because it's hot. That is a great observation. eBird does a lot of stuff in the background when it's creating models. Not these, but like intense models of migration and patterns to account for those sort of things. We call that effort. But in a graph like this, yeah, that could certainly be a factor. Maybe there's fewer people out observing. But I think the bird biology that y'all pointed out, that birds are nesting at this period of time, is also playing a factor here. So this period of time in early and mid-June is usually kind of the first nesting cycle of the summer. And once that nesting cycle is started, female birds get super secretive. The males might be singing a little bit less because they've attracted their mate already. So might be a little harder to detect. And the females are actively trying to be sneaky. They don't want you to know where their nest is. So it might be in part that there's less folks out birding. It might also be in part because these birds are being super secretive and they're just harder to detect. Cool things to think about that you can start seeing in this data. So another thing I'd love to encourage you to think about in relation to feeding birds is encouraging student inquiry. So there's lots of really cool opportunities to ask and answer our own questions about birds when it comes to bird feeding. We do have a curriculum that's all about inquiry called Investigating Evidence. There's a new version in the works that will hopefully be released fairly soon, but for now the old version is available as a free download, and it will scaffold the inquiry process for you. But I wanted to just show you a couple examples of some projects that have been shared with us. So this first one was looking at do birds prefer feeders on a pole or in a tree? And in the upper graph, we can see that we were looking at number of birds total between the tree and pole feeder. And the tree feeder had far more birds attending than the pole feeder. The second figure is looking at the number of species that visited each feeder. And you can see that there are, across the board pretty much, the tree feeder was preferred by every single species. So that could be a pretty easy experiment to set up, hang feeders, the same type of feeder in two different locations and figure out some preference there. Another feeder experiment that I love is this combined class of, I think it was K1 students, and they were interested in the effect of snow depth on the number of birds that they observed at their feeder. So they were using skills that they were building, counting skills and measuring skills, and doing their experiment, only counting the number of birds. So you don't necessarily have to be able to identify birds to species to be able to do a really great inquiry project. So they were just counting the total number of birds, and that was still a really useful measure here. You can go more in depth, like this experiment that we looked at, where it broke it down by species, but you don't have to. So there's all sorts of ways that you can incorporate some really awesome science learning opportunities with bird feeding, either through citizen science or inquiry. Now, I wanted to take a moment and touch base about the big why again, when it comes to citizen science and feeding birds, and why should we care about birds in general. So I want to say it was 2019. This study that the Cornell Lab of Ornithology did with a lot of other really awesome organizations who care about birds looked at the total number of birds in Canada and the US, and wanted to see what the trend in this total number of birds was in the last 50 years, and found that since 1970, we've lost 2.9 billion birds in total from Canada and the United States in just the span of a human lifetime. That's a pretty staggering number of birds. And it does kind of put up some flags for us because we're seeing similar declines in insect species. So this is kind of a warning for us that something's happening in our ecosystems. They're not able to support life in quite the same way that they were able to. What that translates to in easier to understand numbers, because 2.9 is just such a difficult number, 2.9 billion, excuse me, is such a difficult number to wrap your brain around, is 1 in 4 birds gone since 1970. But I know those trends are scary. There's a lot of reason to hope. So we saw gains in 3 groups of birds: raptors, waterfowl, and woodpeckers. And that's because we had concerted conservation efforts for all of these groups. For raptors, we eliminated DDT from our landscapes. For waterfowl, we were managing wetlands. For woodpeckers, we were managing forest lands in such a way that allowed these species to actually increase in numbers. So to me, this says that when we know there's a problem and when we act on the problem and are willing to put our time and money, resources into these problems, we can solve them. We can help these species recover. So it's really important for us to know about these trends. And as I was saying earlier, citizen science data is key in finding these trends. So this study was actually using Christmas bird count data in conjunction with other data sets. And Christmas bird count, I think, is the oldest citizen science project in North America. I have to double check on that. It's certainly one of the oldest citizen science projects in North America. And all these organizations who participated in this study came together to create these 7 simple actions to help birds. A lot of these are things that you could talk about with your students: reducing plastic use, making windows safer for birds. If you have a green space and have the ability to modify green space at your school, you could do some native plant projects. Hopefully your students aren't drinking coffee just yet, but probably you are. So that's something you can think of. But I really wanted to draw your attention to this point here, is doing citizen science. So feeding birds is a really fantastic entry point to starting to care about birds and starting to make this connection to your local habitats. And citizen science is a way that you can enhance that learning for your students, really bring in some fantastic science skills and content, and also help birds and help solve this problem that we know is out there now, and help be part of the group of folks who's going to detect those trends when we turn things around. So I just want to encourage you to recognize the big picture. When you are bringing birds into your students, you're opening the door to them being part of the big picture of conservation and helping birds. So it's really wonderful that you have this interest and that you want to bring birds into your students' lives and share this with them. And it's a really great way for them to feel empowered to make change. Because I think for our young people right now, there's a lot of challenging messages they're receiving about the world, and it can feel like there's not something that you can do, and citizen science can be a productive way to channel some of that energy and provide some hope. So we talked a little bit about some of these other ways that you can help, but citizen science is a great start. All right, so we are running short on time, but I want to throw it out to you and see if you have any questions about some of the resources we talked about tonight, feeding birds, or hey, anything else related to birds. And while you're thinking, if you're new to our webinar series, we do provide contact letters for our series. So if you would like a contact letter from us, contact letter is not the right term, is it? A completion letter for 1 contact hour. There it is. You can email us at k12lab@cornell.edu. I forgot to put in the slide with our contact information here, so I'm going to ask Susan to share that email in the chat window. Oh, she already did. And we will be able to send that letter out to you. I'm seeing in the chat window that Susan fact-checked the Christmas bird count claim that, yes, it is the oldest citizen science project. Awesome. Catherine's got her bird feeder coming. Awesome. Michelle is commenting that the shade-grown coffee was a new idea. Yeah, so shade-grown coffee is actually really fantastic for birds, and birds can be really helpful for growing coffee as well and helping eliminate some pests. So it's kind of a win-win there. All right, well, we're going to hang out for another couple minutes. Please feel free to keep sharing thoughts in the chat window. Otherwise, I'm going to mute myself for a second and hope to see you in a future webinar. Thanks so much.